Good afternoon, everyone, and a warm welcome to our virtual Asia Society. I'm Su-Ming Wong, Chairman and CEO of Chem Ventures, and a board member of Asia Society Australia. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's event, Fear, Compassion, or Xenophobia, our social responses to crisis. I trust everyone is safe and well under these challenging times. Before we begin, Asia Society acknowledges that many participants in today's event are dialing in from locations that have traditional owners and custodians. I'm currently on Gadigal land. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge all traditional owners and to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I also like to welcome Aboriginals, Torres Strait Islanders, and all First Nation people joining us today. Sorry, I lost my track there. Our discussion today is much needed. Asia Society is dedicated to promote a deeper understanding of Asia and to build bridges between cultures. In our current climate, we believe this mission has never been more relevant. This pandemic provides us with the opportunity to examine the complex weave that is our social fabric and to question our reactions to crisis. We will be discussing how governments, institutions, companies, and individuals can promote unity in the face of fear. This program idea came about partly in response to an open letter that I co-signed with 15 other prominent Asian Australians last month, calling out instances of distrust, disenfranchisement, and vilifications of Asian Australians. As most of you know, COVID-19 has intensified anti-Asian sentiments, and we have witnessed a surge of racial abuse. This crisis is not a time for us to turn against one another. It is a time for social cohesion and national unity. It is my pleasure to take part in today's event. Before we hear from our esteemed speakers, I'm pleased to give the floor to the CEO of Asia Society Australia, Philip Ivanov. He will go through today's proceedings and introduce our panel members. Thank you. Philip?
Thank you, Su-Ming. Thanks for your kind introduction. Also, thank you so much for your advocacy on this issue. It's very, very important. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome again to Asia Society online, but hopefully live soon, given that the events of the last few days. Before I introduce our panel, I want to emphasize that this is an interactive program, as interactive as one can be on Zoom. And we hope that you submit your questions via the group chat that you can see on your right-hand side. And we will, or I will rather, moderate those questions and put them to our panelists. So please make sure that you submit those questions as soon as we start the discussion. This is a very important conversation, and very pleased to have a terrific group of experts, commentators with us today to discuss it. So let me introduce our speakers, today's panelists, Vivienne Nguyen, Tim Soutphommasane, and Jessica Wirawan. Vivienne is the chairperson of the Victorian Multicultural Commission, with more than 25 years experience in the corporate, public and community sectors. Vivienne is a passionate advocate for diversity and multiculturalism. She was previously president of the Vietnamese community in Australia, Victorian chapter, and played a key role in advocating for Australia's first Vietnamese Cultural Museum. Welcome, Vivienne. Tim Soutphommasane is a professor of sociology and political theory and director of culture strategy at the University of Sydney. He is a political theorist and human rights advocate. He was Australia's Race Discrimination Commissioner from 2013 to 2018. His thinking on patriotism, multiculturalism, and national identity has been very influential in debates in Australia and Britain and beyond. He also co-chairs the Screen Diversity Inclusion Network and a member of the advisory board of Media Diversity Australia. Jessica is a senior manager of PwC Australia Diversity and Inclusion team. With over 9 years of experience at PwC, she joined the team in 2016, and she was responsible for developing and driving the firm's strategy for diversity and inclusion, which is one of the nation's champions in this space. In 2018, she joined PwC Diversity and Inclusion Consulting Practice, helping organizations to realize the benefits of diversity and inclusion. And she was also a participant in Asia Society 2017 Gen A Young Leaders Program. So welcome, Jessica, team, Vivienne. Let me get straight into these very complex issues that we're discussing today. Let me start with Tim. Tim, how can you explain some of the extreme reactions we've seen to the pandemic? For example, theft of medical supplies, fighting over toilet paper, assault and racism, denouncing neighbors. What is the impact of fear? Does fear make us forget social norms and decency? Where do these feelings and reactions stem from?
Philip, it's got a lot to do with fear and a lot to do with anxiety. People are understandably scared about COVID-19. This is the first global pandemic that has really hit Australia, at least, in living memory. Obviously, other countries in recent decades have dealt with pandemics as well, but Australia has been relatively isolated from such global events. Not this time. And we're seeing people really go to all sorts of lengths to protect themselves and also to cast blame on others. So we've seen this evolve through a number of stages that you've touched on. Obviously, the panic buying that took place very early on this year was a harbinger of things to come. Then you've had mounting prejudice and racism directed at people from Chinese and more broadly Asian backgrounds here in Australia as well as in many other countries. There's a lot of blame that's being attached to people from Chinese and Asian backgrounds because of the virus's apparent origins in Wuhan, China. It's hard to separate as well a lot of the anti-Chinese sentiment from the anti-China sentiment or the hostility against the Chinese Communist Party. So that's been another factor you've seen here. And then on top of all this, I would say that the coronavirus has just provided a lot of people with an excuse to vent prejudice and hostility that may have already been existing. So you've had an excuse now for some people to target others and to vilify and discriminate against others. But this all adds up to a significant threat to our social cohesion and to our social fabric, and we need to respond with unity as a society. We need to have leadership both in our politics, but also in our civil society on this, because if we're not careful, we're going to see damage last for many years to come here, and this isn't going to be an easy situation for us to undo.
Thank you, Tim. A question to you, Vivienne. What is the role of and the impact of the government's communication on people's reaction to the crisis? And also more specifically in Victoria, the attribution of blame on a racial basis carries huge risks on social cohesion, as Tim pointed out. What's the Victorian government doing to tackle these issues and promote social cohesion?
Thanks for that. I really appreciate Tim's eloquent response to the separation of what is anti-China, anti-Chinese, and anti the Chinese Communist Party. That now gives people the opportunity to vent and to take it out on other members of our Australian community is really disheartening, in my opinion, to observe and to see over the last few months. The communicate the government, and in this instance, the Victorian government, and across the number of ministers, including the minister to whom I report for multicultural affairs, is really important, and it cannot be underestimated. And communicating to the people takes a number of media platforms and channels. And regardless of how much of an effort we tried, in Victoria, for example, the number of materials that have been translated into different languages is far more than our other jurisdictions. But it doesn't negate the confusion, the fake news and the misinformation, particularly in the first few weeks of this pandemic, and particularly when news and information from other countries, from overseas, channeled through to members of the multicultural communities here in Victoria, really created that sense of confusion for a lot of the people. And this is where I suppose in many ways we work directly with the Department of Health and Human Services within this government to support and to ensure that the information provided to the community can be provided in through many different channels and avenues, using from the media through the social media, print media, trusted people in the communities to really try and get the message through. But even with our best effort, it doesn't always reach, and people deliberately or otherwise, through frustration, as Tim's comment, observation, but through a variety of other issues, really creates that sense of disharmony in our community. And communication isn't just from the government, it also requires leaders in our society from all walks of life. And I'm pleased in many ways to see many leaders across the broad spectrum of our society taking that role, and as it is now in Asia Society Australia.
Thank you, Vivienne. Let me turn to Jessica and to talk a little bit about how is corporate Australia responding to some of these social issues arising from the crisis, and particularly how is your workforce experiencing it? How is it impacting the workplace culture and your diversity and inclusion agenda? But also, how do you maintain the importance of this agenda in a socially distant workplace?
Thanks, Philip. I think like all workplaces, our workforce is just experiencing the rapid sense of change and just trying to adjust to all that, and acknowledging that everyone's going to experience COVID-19 impacts very differently. Our offices have been shut for a while now, and people have been working from home. One thing that has helped with this transition is having that flexible working policy and campaigns around that early on ahead of time, so that people could start to get used to this and build this into our workplace culture. I think naturally there's been a really big impact on the sense of connectivity, with people not being able to have those face-to-face conversations. It's a lot harder to stay connected in this virtual environment. But one positive from this has been people are able to have really different, maybe more authentic conversations with people, with video, Zoom and Google, being able to see people's children's pets, kind of cats and dogs popping into the frame here and there. And I think you get to see people in a really different light and see what's really going on for them. And I think this really helps to break down some barriers and build a stronger sense of trust. And I'm hoping this will see a potential to shift D&I further in the workplace and for other organisations as well. And leaders really need to engage with people just to understand what's going on for them, what really works for them, to help them thrive in this challenging environment. And I think people are experiencing the more obvious challenges of increased care responsibilities from children not being able to go go to school or how to manage virtual teams. But I think that one less obvious impact, at least in the corporate context, is what's the impact in isolation of the rise of these reported xenophobic attacks on the Asian community and the Asian Australian community. And I know reading the media, me personally, I've felt that sense of increased anxiety and thinking about how it impacts everyday decisions. So whether I want to go outside into the community, grocery shopping, and how that impacts people. And I'm sure other people in our workforce are feeling that sense of fear or anxiety, and thinking about the impact that has on mental health, and how workplaces can start to focus on that to be able to support their people through these times. And aside from personal safety, people are worrying about their parents, about their children. I know I've made that phone call to my parents around make sure you're safe, or be careful when you go outside. And I'm sure many on the call have had the same experience, and feeling that strange sense of role reversal as well. And having these fears compounded with the social signals that we see about who does and who doesn't belong. Seeing that lack of Asian representation, especially in media, can just kind of really exacerbate that sense of fear and anxiety. And I think all these factors will have an impact, especially on mental health in the workforce. In terms of our D&I agenda, where we continue to focus on diversity and inclusion really heavily, it's still a core part of our firm strategy. The partner that I work with sits on our executive board, and I think that's a really strong and positive signal in these times of uncertainty about how we're looking at prioritising D&I and making sure that there's a D&I lens across all major decisions. We've also had that stronger focus on mental health, safety and well-being, looking at the support and referral channels that we've got, and looking at that real mental health strategy and making sure we have that in a really cohesive, comprehensive way to support our people. And I think the challenges with COVID have started to open up the conversation on racism in a really different way. And I think usually people might associate cultural diversity with food or with celebrations, but I think it can be a really great catalyst to start having some of the more tougher or more difficult conversations about people's experiences and racism, and how do we also leverage the challenges around the Asian community, but also how do we link this with the racism experience by the Muslim community, by the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community as well, and how do we look to move forward together. And in terms of how do we maintain D&I in this socially distant workplace, I think just understanding what people need and how COVID might affect different people in different ways, regularly checking in with teams. So it sounds really simple, but has had a really strong impact, and finding creative ways of connecting with your teams more regularly. So in our team, we do optional virtual coffees, and it just gives people a space to have that social interaction that you're not talking about work, but you still maintain that sense of connectivity. And also thinking about not just D&I in the context of social, in terms of isolation and while the offices are closed, but once the offices reopen and we go back into those environments, thinking about what are the D&I considerations there. So there might be availability bias. Do we only give opportunities to those people that we can physically see? Are there in-groups and out-groups, or how do we prevent that? And also looking at the rise in the xenophobic attacks, are people feeling a sense of safety in their commute to go to work? And then what impact is that having on our workforce?
Thank you, Jessica. Just staying on this important issue of racism. Tim, we have seen, and all three of you talked about these troubling instances of racism towards the Asian Australian community, but also our visitors, our international students and tourists, since the outbreak of the COVID-19. Now, do you think is there an overall increase of racism, or has this pandemic just heightened our awareness of a problem that is more systemic? And I guess another part of that question is, what role does herd mentality have in our reaction to the coronavirus? Has the media fanned the flames of racism, in your view?
So first of all, there has been an increase in the experience of racism, and we know this based on, for example, what the Australian Human Rights Commission has been saying regarding the complaints that it's been receiving. So I don't think it's just a matter of people becoming more aware or reporting incidents that were occurring which weren't being reported previously. Why is that happening? Well, I think you touch on some of that, Philip, with your question. There's a license that's been given to people to be scapegoating those from Chinese backgrounds in particular, and ascribing responsibility for the coronavirus to people from Chinese backgrounds. Of course, that's nonsensical in one sense, in that the viruses don't discriminate, and I don't think Australians from Chinese backgrounds, or for that matter, international students from Chinese or Asian backgrounds, are culpable for a virus breaking out in China and other parts of the world. But that's what we've seen, and some of the media coverage of the virus has perhaps contributed to that. So earlier this year, we did have a number of headlines in some of our newspapers, particularly the News Corp newspapers, really targeting China and those from Chinese backgrounds, at least many people would say. And then, of course, you have the effect of the likes of Donald Trump in calling the coronavirus the Chinese virus, or the China virus. Using that kind of language can encourage people to target those from Chinese backgrounds. So I don't think we're seeing something that's just been brought to the surface. But this isn't, of course, to deny the more systematic elements that may be at play here. You could say that the conditions for the rise in racism were created in many debates of the past. The fact that you do have a tendency within national debates to single out people from China for various issues. For example, so-called Chinese buyers crowding out the property market and preventing local first home buyers from getting a foot on the property ladder. Or you think of the stories of Chinese background people hoarding goods in supermarkets. These sorts of tropes and these sorts of stories and stereotypes can feed into fear and anxiety when you do have a pandemic situation playing out. And it lends itself to all kinds of misinformation as well. To give you a very clear example, think about the rumors that were spread about busloads of tourists or tourist buses going to regional centres in New South Wales and Victoria, cleaning out supermarkets. Now, there's been absolutely no evidence of that happening, and yet those stories were circulating very rapidly and appeared to have been given credence by otherwise reasonable people. So what you're seeing here is a predisposition that people may have to suspect those from Chinese backgrounds and other backgrounds of doing things that one doesn't agree with, or that one believes is inappropriate. So that's what we're seeing being generated here in the crisis situation that we're in.
Thank you, Tim. And just staying on that question, you mentioned that President Trump's rhetoric played a role in the rise in kind of antagonism towards China. Do you think that China's actions itself, China's first response to the COVID crisis, China's subsequent actions in that sort of public diplomacy domain, playing a role in the rise of sort of anti-Chinese sentiment?
I think we could say this. I think everyone agrees that the Chinese government could have acted much faster and much more decisively once it knew that there'd been an outbreak of the virus in Wuhan. I think that's indisputable. But let's remember there've been many other countries who had the benefit of a few weeks or even months of prior notice based on the China experience, who themselves have failed to respond appropriately. I mean, I think if we're going to look at culpability and think about criticizing governments for a lack of speed in responding, there isn't just one government that is culpable here. And if we look at how this affects Australia, the numbers of cases of coronavirus that have entered into Australia from Europe and the US far outnumber the number of cases that have been brought in from China and from Asia. So I think if you're going to judge government responses, I would say the early part of the Chinese government's response was lackluster, but once lockdowns and once isolation measures were introduced, it was very clear that the curve was flattened in China. You look at what happened in Italy, what's happening at the moment in the UK, what's happening in the US. These are also clear examples of governments not responding quickly and decisively enough to the coronavirus danger. Australia's been very fortunate, I think, in having fairly effective government responses to the situation from a public health perspective.
Thank you, Tim. A question to Vivienne on what can be done to curb racism and anti-Asian sentiment, and who should be responsible for it, and what do you see as the role of the government and role of business in it?
Philip, I wish it was an easy answer. Racism is, to me, the approach to racism or to reduce or minimize or eliminate racism is, to me, more of an approach and a process and not an outcome in and of itself, because it requires multiple solutions from multiple angles, and it is a responsibility for each and every one of us. When we take our citizenship, we pledge our loyalty to this country, and this institution, these democratic institutions, and the values of this institution and this country does not include racism. And so it is a responsibility for each and every one of us. Government plays a significant role in terms of policy, in terms of direction, and so do businesses, community organizations, multicultural organizations, and everyone from all walks of life to do that. In Victoria, we have the Victorian Multicultural Commission continues to work with the government and various departments to push a number of systemic issues, whether that be from workforce, participation, representation, right through to making sure that every time you make an announcement, you've got your communication in different languages and in different channels to ensure that everybody gets the opportunity to be able to receive information timely and accurately. So there are a range of issues that we're looking at. We're looking at working with the Human Rights and Equal Opportunities Commission in Victoria to work out how we can increase accessibility to reporting, and to make sure that to support them in terms of there is the investigation process and the penalty process. We also have in Victoria the anti-vilifications protections draft bill that's being considered at the moment. And ongoing education and awareness is something that I also believe needs to be continued, and understanding ways in which the victim can be provided with the support, and there isn't very clear avenue or a number of avenues available for the victims to be able to report, but also to receive the support to support them as they go through that experience, that trauma. Some of those and many of those aspects that I've mentioned aren't in existence at the moment, and if they are not strong enough, or the thresholds are too high for people to be able to take a complaint all the way from a complaint to a court decision. So these are some of the things that we are looking to do over the coming weeks and months, to be able to support the communities better, to be able to impact some of the systemic changes that we believe needs to be done more to expedite that process. And like people say, never waste a crisis, and that there are some of the things that we're trying to push through. We also are vocal about the number of the increases in the number of incidents that have been happening recently, and Tim's absolutely right. It has increased many times, and even before the number of increases occur, we also know that the reporting has always been underestimated. People just don't report. My own sister experienced that, myself experienced that just a few days ago at Safeway. We just don't report it because we think it's all too hard. Where is it going to go? Once you've looked at the process, you just kind of throw your hands up in the air and think it's too hard. I can get I might be able to share that with my family or my friends, and I might be able to share it now on social media. But the whole process, from the time you experience it to the time you lodge a complaint, to the time you get a court outcome, and whether or not there is a penalty for the perpetrator and be able to hold him or her or them to account, isn't necessarily that particularly easy or accessible at the moment. So there's some of the things that we are doing, but we believe it is a responsibility of all of us, and that's the fundamental foundations of this country. We do not accept racism, and it is each and every one of our responsibility to be able to do that, and we need to do that.
Thank you, Vivienne. You answered some of the questions that coming through from the audience, but just to, I want to ask you, for all of these viewers on Zoom, and we also have viewers on YouTube, quite a few people logging in, if they are, for example, victims of racist abuse, what are the avenues for them to report this abuse and also seek help? Psychological or otherwise?
Yeah. So at the moment, in Victoria, one can report through the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission. They can also report to the police. And they're the two typical avenues that people go to if they want to make a report. Typically, people don't, because the Racial and Religious Tolerance Act, which is currently in existence in Victoria, covers the racial and religious. It doesn't cover other aspects, and it's not based on the notion of incitement. So the threshold is really high for people to be able to report and actually see something through. For the last, 18, 19, 20 years of that act being in existence, there are 3 cases that have been prosecuted. And I think only 1 was successful. So it's, and when we did the consultations late last year, when the draft bill was being introduced, we ran it across 200 or 300 community representatives and leaders. Hardly any of them have heard about the act. And if they did, they didn't know what it meant. And we have massive confusion between what is vilification and racism versus discrimination. And it just, the conversation really kind of oscillates between these aspects. And so in the end, the whole thing is just really confusing. And what we are hoping to do as part of that process, but also as part of the pandemic, is to really try and work through and get some cut through in terms of transparency and accessibility, to be able to support people understand how to report, where does that go, what supports are available for them as they go through that process, because at the moment there isn't any clear support for the victim if they wish to report. If they do report, they're on their own, largely.
Thank you, Vivienne. Jessica, just turning to corporate Australia again. You as a leader in a diversity and inclusion space, are you satisfied with the way that corporations and businesses have responded to some of these incidents of racism? And what else can corporations do to both internally improving their own culture, as well as being as social advocates for and stand up for Asian Australian community?
Thanks, Philip. I think leaders and corporates definitely have a role to play. And I think what we're seeing, at least from my experience, is less about xenophobia and kind of blatant racism in the workplace, but more how we looking at how that's happening with the rise that Tim mentioned in incidents in the community. How are we acknowledging that there's no kind of divide between people when they're in the workforce and then people in the community, and what's the impact of people feeling that sense of lack of safety in the community, and how does the workplace play a role to support that. I think in terms of leveraging and valuing cultural diversity, leaders have a role to show a sense of visible focus and embracing and valuing cultural diversity. And I think a key catalyst to start to have this conversation in corporates is about getting some of the data and understanding what is the picture of the workforce, what is the cultural diversity picture. And there's been, I think, a key challenge for a lot of corporates in being able to do this in a consistent way, which makes a lot of people kind of just throw it into the too hard basket. But I think that's been a really critical catalyst for us to really have a stronger conversation about what are the issues, where are kind of any drop-off points, how do we understand the makeup of our workforce, and then who might be at risk, who do we need to wrap our arms around and provide support and have those active conversations with. I think other things that workplaces can do to provide support is really upskilling people to be active bystanders and being able to call out behaviours and disrupt things as soon as they occur where it's safe to do so. How can we start, and how can we also start calling out those smaller microaggressions that might happen in the workplace, such as simple things like getting name pronunciations wrong or names spelt wrong, assuming where people are from, and starting to have a productive conversation about that. Because if we ignore those smaller things, I think it starts to become a part of the culture of what's accepted and what society accepts. So having that stronger signal. And I think we've also seen really great advocacy from Chinese Australians and people in the Asian community using their platform to speak against racism, but to drive progress. I think we need allies, corporates, organisations, and the wider Australian community to also step up and stand together. And I think it's a lot more powerful when it comes from people that are in the majority to send that signal that racism has no place in our society. And lastly, I think there's an opportunity for corporates to really drive those meaningful mainstream discussions about racism, like today's discussion, and be able to provide support for communities, share what those referral pathways are, and give people that sense of immediate connection. So, for example, at PwC, we have Be at PwC Cultural Diversity Employee Network, and that just provides that sense of connection and belonging for people to share those stories, share their experiences, and really drive those discussions. And I think that's been a key factor that's helped.
Thanks, Jessica. And just staying with you, I have a question from the audience about the reporting on TV of the COVID pandemic, which was dominated by images of people of Asian heritage. What sort of role do you think media plays in this issue? And are you satisfied with how Australian media has been reporting both the pandemic itself, but also the social issues that it triggered in Australia, particularly racism?
I think media has an incredibly significant role to play, and in how they drive the messaging and drive people's understanding of the issues and what's happening and what people take as fact. And even pre-COVID, having a look at media, who's represented on TV, who's represented in just websites and general pictures and photos and things that you see in the news. You don't really see a lot of Asian representation unless it's a kind of negative story. So I think that helps create a really, I guess, negative messaging sometimes. But I think the role that people can play is also how do they start to challenge these. Like, for example, on Instagram, I'm seeing a lot of people starting to report and flag where they see these incidents happening. And then I think that also sends that signal that this is not okay and this is quite racist behaviour. So I think people also have a role to play in looking at how they absorb or read media as well, looking to get a more robust and diverse view of the news websites that they read, so that they can have that stronger discussion and really get the facts and not, I guess, be influenced by some of the channels that might have, I guess, more extreme views.
Thank you, Jessica. Just question to Tim, more about the future of multiculturalism in this country. We're probably going to see limits on migration. We currently have severe limitations on international travel. We see the rise in sort of fault lines or widening fault lines within our society. Are you worried about the future of multiculturalism in this country?
We've got to be careful that we don't go backwards on our multiculturalism, and we can't be complacent about this. Obviously, the drawbridge has been pulled. We're seeing migration come to more or less a stop for at least the time being, and you're right to say that the numbers of migrants coming in will fall. This is going to have some social and economic consequences. The Australian economy has not been in recession for the past 3 decades, and I don't think everyone realises just how inextricably bound the Australian economic experience is with a robust immigration program. So I think there's going to be an economic cost of having reduced migration. You're going to see more pronounced skills shortages in some industries. You're going to see some industries suffer from more severe demand issues as a result of fewer migrants coming in. Now, of course, you can make an argument in favour of lower migration that is about issues of quality of life or congestion as well. But I think we've got to be pretty open in recognising that there are direct economic costs that will be associated with a reduction in migration. One of the real challenges we have with our multiculturalism is bound up in our response to racism. Multiculturalism just can't be about celebrating diversity or celebrating difference. It's also got to be about combating prejudice and securing equal opportunity. So there's a real need here, if we're serious about having a multicultural society, that we take strong anti-racism measures. At the federal or Commonwealth level, we haven't seen federal funding for a national anti-racism program for almost 5 years now. This would be an opportune time for government to step in and show some leadership there. There's also an important need for advocates for multiculturalism to step up here and make sure that people do understand their legal rights and their protections against racism. I mean, going back to what Vivienne was saying about the Victorian situation and state legislation in Victoria, there are obstacles there, of course, because of the concern with an incitement to racial hatred. But if you look at the Commonwealth legal protections, people have a protection against racial hatred that is of a very different quality to what you have under state laws in Victoria, New South Wales and other states. So the law you have in the form of the Racial Discrimination Act isn't directed at incitement to racial hatred. It's concerned with anything that causes racial offence, humiliation, intimidation, and that's a different kind of standard that's used in the law. So I would hope that we see through this greater education of communities by advocates of the avenues that people can take to report racism and incidents of racial hostility. But we've got to be clear here. This is not an easy or a smooth time for multiculturalism. We're going to see a very rocky period given the economic deterioration we're just beginning to go through. There will be significant debates about the role of migration in our society. There'll be a lot of fears and anxieties expressed about migrants taking jobs. And the reality is that migrants create jobs. So we're going to have a debate about that. And when you look at the global context of rising nationalist populism, I think we're going to see a very challenging period ahead.
Thank you, Tim. I have a question, probably best if you start, on something that you mentioned, and that is the confluence of policies and actions of the Chinese government versus Chinese people or Chinese Australian people. And the question is, how do advocates for transparency and policy change cut through in highlighting this misguiding and often xenophobic confluence of these two terms, the Chinese government or the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese community, Chinese people?
Well, we've just got to keep making sure that you can draw that distinction. Unfortunately, people don't always draw that distinction. Just because someone has a Chinese background does not mean that they're answerable for the actions of the Chinese party state or the Chinese Communist Party. If you're an Australian citizen, you should be treated as an Australian citizen. If you're Australian, then you should be considered Australian. You shouldn't have to answer for what happens in China. You know, I've got Chinese heritage, but why do I have to answer for what happens in China or what the Chinese government does? That's the kind of logic that would lead someone to hold a white Caucasian Australian to account for the actions of Donald Trump or for Boris Johnson because of their racial characteristics. I don't see that happening very often because it's idiotic. It's also idiotic if you apply it to people from Chinese and Asian backgrounds. That's the basic challenge we've got here to do that. I also find it troubling sometimes to even find among those who know better a demand that you have to denounce what's happening in a particular country in order to demonstrate your legitimacy or your bona fides. But the implication, for example, of saying to an Asian Australian who is advocating for a measure in Australia or who is talking about an issue in Australia, they've got to take a position on China or what's happening in China. I think the underlying message there is that that person is still ultimately being judged by their ethnicity or their background, not being accepted as Australian in their own terms. Now, I think that's one part of the debate we've got to keep an eye on, because it'd be very unfair, I think, to expect people to have to demonstrate their loyalty 2 or 3 times more powerfully than with any other member of the community. Yet that's where we are at the moment with a lot of the debate that we have around China and the actions of the Chinese government. I don't think Australians who have Chinese background, who are Australian citizens, who may be born here, who may have no connection to China, let alone the Chinese Communist Party, have to answer for the actions of the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government.
Thank you, Tim. We're almost out of time, but I want to finish on a positive question, and that question should go to Vivienne, I think. And the question is, do you see any positive change coming out of this pandemic?
Well, Philip, I listen to Tim and I find that the Tim's argument absolutely fascinating. I don't know why people of Asian backgrounds have to be held to account for what happens over there when people like me actually left my own country because I didn't support that particular that regime. So it's kind of weird as to why we think that we have to be held account for what's happening over there when I have no connection to what's happening to that government over there. I think though, what I'm seeing, yes, it is very disheartening to see, to hear of the increases in incidents of racism against members of the Asian community here in Australia and Victoria. I'm also seeing a lot of compassion and a lot of stories of compassion that are happening right across the multicultural communities, from the faiths working together through to different communities supporting another community. And there are so many of those stories that we are seeing, and we are putting them on the spotlight because I fundamentally believe that is Victoria and that is Australia, and our democratic system puts us in that position that we are able to do that. We're able to demonstrate and exhibit our compassion And that is a much better part and a much bigger part of us than the experiences that we have seen on the racism aspect. Not to say that it isn't insignificant, that doesn't require attention. It absolutely does, and we are doing our best on that front. But I really believe that there will be many positive lessons learned out of this. And we, for one, the Victorian Multicultural Commission, will definitely work our hardest and our best to make sure that the better part of us is more on display than the more deplorable part of our humanity. And I absolutely believe that it is necessary for us to do that, because Tim is absolutely right. If we're not careful, if we're not diligent and vigilant, we don't want to go backwards.
Thank you, Vivienne. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but this is a fascinating conversation. And there's so many more questions that I had on other social issues that emerged as a result of the pandemic. But also, it's going to be a huge test, I think, for our society, for our country. Public health test, economic test, but also social test. And we just touched on some of the aspects of it. But on behalf of Asia Society and all our listeners and viewers, I want to thank Tim, Jessica, and Vivienne for joining us. Fascinating discussion, and to Sue-Min for opening it. And please join us for other events. We have a huge program of online events and discussion coming out. And stay connected, and most importantly, stay safe. And to all our viewers, thank you very much for joining us.